Well, the strategic context was a situation in which the effort was failing. It wasn't just a perception, it was a reality. And the reality on the ground that greeted me when I arrived back in Iraq was even worse, frankly, than I'd sensed it was from afar. I tried very hard to keep a hand on this, if you will, or at least to keep my head in the game on it. I would go through the daily battlefield update and analysis slides that were available through the secure military internet. I certainly read articles from the embedded reporters in particular, which were so valuable because they were out there with our troopers on the ground, conveying back what our own small unit leaders were saying about it. I mean, one of them, I remember the title of the article was "Driving Around Baghdad Waiting to Get Blown Up." I mean, this was not a reflection of a sergeant who was confident in the strategy that was being pursued. And of course, it was a situation in which the President of the United States had decided to radically change what was being done, at least in terms of committing additional forces rather than drawing down, and of course, replace the military and diplomatic leaders there as well. When I went out in the first day, after taking command, right away we went out and went on some patrols with some units in Baghdad, and then subsequent to that went out to Ramadi to see the reconciliation effort that was going on there. But in the streets of Baghdad, I was shocked. I'd been in Baghdad off and on since 2003, all over all the neighborhoods there as a three-star. We rebuilt the police stations and a lot of infrastructure for the Iraqi security forces. And I was really stunned, frankly, to see some of these neighborhoods that I'd remembered as thriving, prosperous, even well-to-do neighborhoods where we'd built quite impressive Iraqi security force infrastructure, to see deserted neighborhoods, the police stations blown up, houses empty. In one place, in fact, we actually saw tumbleweed blowing down the street, and it seemed to be an image, I guess, that spoke volumes about the situation. So we went on patrol in these areas, and frankly, when I got back from that, it was a whole day out there. We talked to our leaders on the ground. It was clear how serious the situation was and how much work was going to have to be done to reestablish security in these areas, to build our locations in each of them. And in fact, we had one joint security station about to go in one of these locations that became a little bit of a canary in the mine shaft for me ever after in Ghazaliya, where the very first of the joint security stations, as I recall, in the Baghdad area, and periodically would go back and visit. And that was one that really showed what was possible if you lived with the people and they knew you were going to be there with them and not just drive back to your base at night for dinner and see them again the next morning. When they knew you were there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all of a sudden, usually within the first week or two, locals who stayed in those areas would start to share with our soldiers information because they wanted to see the bad guys out of their neighborhoods, and they wanted us to do just that in partnership with our Iraqi police and army comrades. So this is a very, very tough situation. And again, when I was done that day, actually, when we went back to the place where we had the places where we slept at night and so forth, I actually put my head down on the desk for a moment and thought to myself, why in the world did I taken this on? It was a pretty desperate situation. Levels of violence were catastrophic. The month that the president decided on the surge, I think there were 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours in Baghdad alone. And that's what greeted us, and that was the context in which we implemented the surge. Well, first of all, is what I did to try to get the big ideas right in my own head, and indeed to help our Army and indeed the Marine Corps, because we did this in partnership with General Mattis of the U.S. Marine Corps, what we sought to do to help those institutions develop the right big ideas as well. So during that 15-month period that I was back in the United States, having returned from a 15-and-a-half-month tour as a three-star heading the train and equip mission in Iraq, we spent a great deal of time working our way through, again, ideas, working our way through concepts, what should the strategy be and so forth. This included the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. It included articles for Military Review magazine. Indeed, we had a writing contest for counterinsurgency using Military Review, which was also under the purview of the 3-star, which position I held at that time, command of the Combined Arms Center. And we worked very, very hard and with considerable rigor to try to get this set in our head, so that when I actually did deploy, I'd been told that it was quite likely that I was going to go back to Iraq. There was only one position to which I could return, presumably, and that would be to be the commander of the multinational force in Iraq. The call came, frankly, a bit earlier than I'd expected, when the president decided to conduct the surge and decided to make the change of leadership at the time that surge was launched. But when I went back over there, and having already had nearly 2.5 years on the ground, I had a pretty good idea, as did our other leaders. We'd all been seized with this issue now for a number of years. Most of the commanders that came to Iraq during the surge had had at least one tour, one full-year tour on the ground by that time. Many had 2. And so we were a reasonably experienced group. And again, we'd worked our way through this. We'd made the doctrinal changes. We'd tweaked our organizations. We'd overhauled the training, the so-called road to deployment, every activity along it. We'd completely changed our leader development courses. And so we'd made a number of institutional changes to ensure that our leaders and our units were prepared for the tasks required in Iraq and, of course, in Afghanistan as well. So when I went back over, I knew that the biggest of the big ideas had to be that which focused on security for the people. The center of gravity, if you will, in Iraq was the people. And you can only serve and secure the people if you actually live with them. You can't do it from a big base. And we'd been consolidating on big bases. We'd been gradually getting out of the cities. We reversed that completely. We moved back into the neighborhoods, 77 additional joint security stations, combat outposts, and other locations in the multinational division Baghdad area alone over the course of the next 9 to 12 months, the first year of the surge. And we had to fight for a lot of those. So living with the people to secure them, and indeed recognizing that the decisive terrain in Iraq was the human terrain, that was all big idea number 1. Big idea number 2 was also hugely important. It was that you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, that you have to reconcile with as many of the insurgencies as possible to turn them from being part of the problem into part of the solution. And of course, that informed the entire reconciliation initiative, building on the case of Anbar awakening that had already happened outside Ramadi, but was still quite nascent, in a sense, fanning the flames of that so it would ripple up and down the Euphrates River Valley, creating critical mass that sets off a chain reaction and then goes up the Tigris River Valley and into the Baghdad belts, as they're called, and then into the neighborhoods of Baghdad that were mixed as well. So that was yet another hugely important big idea. Beyond that was recognition that, okay, we'll be able to reconcile with some of them, as many as is possible. And by the way, ultimately we had, as sons of Iraq, some 80,000 Sunni Arab young men and some 20 to 25,000 Shia Arabs with whom we reconciled, who previously were at least either actively or tacitly opposing us and the new Iraq from either of those communities. Then this third big idea relates to that there are irreconcilables, and that the senior leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the most senior of the insurgent leaders, the senior militia leaders, were irreconcilable. And therefore, we had to kill or capture them or run them off. There was nothing else that could be done. And that meant we had to increase quite dramatically the kinetic part of our actions. A lot of people, in fact, have seized on the counterinsurgency field manual and the emphasis on stability operations, but they sometimes forget that you also have offensive and, of course, defensive force protection, but particularly offensive operations in a counterinsurgency, because you've got to clear and hold areas, then rebuild them, and then ultimately, over time, having developed the capabilities of the host nation security forces to transition tasks to them in a progressive manner over time. But going after the irreconcilables, now we've really unleashed the Joint Special Operations Command, our counter-terrorist units, not just U.S., but U.K. and other elements as well. Very aggressive conventional force operations, U.S. and increasingly joined by Iraqi and obviously coalition forces in that effort. Increasing the train and equip program, so that would feed more Iraqi forces into this, and on in that particular effort as well. Again, a number of other initiatives that we took, but those were the biggest of the big ideas. Again, starting with the recognition that the human terrain is a decisive terrain. We must secure the people and serve them, and you can only do that if you live with them. And then that we had to reconcile with as many of the insurgents as we possibly could. We had to give them incentives to support the new Iraq instead of continuing to oppose it, and then very aggressively go after those who are irreconcilable, all while achieving absolute unity between the civilian organizations and the military, as well as with, of course, our Iraqi counterparts in that effort too. Well, Afghanistan was different in that there had been a very comprehensive policy review. That meant considerably more policy guidance, although still very wide latitude to the commander on the ground, but within a certain number of constraints, to be sure. And although there was a surge in Afghanistan, and although President Obama did indeed direct substantial increases in the number of forces there, up to about 100,000, we certainly never got close to where the number that we had in Iraq, 165,000 U.S. soldiers alone, in addition to the coalition troopers. Now, we did have larger involvement of coalition countries in Afghanistan by far. It was the largest coalition, I think, just in terms of numbers of countries in history, somewhere around 60 or so, as I recall. And the coalition contribution was fully half in size that of the United States, which was considerably larger, again, in percentage and in absolute numbers than what we had in Iraq. Beyond that, of course, General McChrystal had been on the ground for a year. He had been overhauling the strategy. He was sent out to do just that, to take what we'd learned from Iraq, where it was applicable, noting that the two circumstances, the two contexts were very, very different in many different respects. In fact, I'd actually, back in 2004, on the way home from Iraq and conducting an assessment for Secretary Rumsfeld, came back and in the very first slide of the briefing that I provided to him, the title was "Afghanistan Does Not Equal Iraq," and enumerated all the differences in several different elements that we looked at. But General McChrystal had been modifying, overhauling the strategy, and so it didn't require the kind of fundamental rethink and fundamental change that we undertook in Iraq. Rather, it required modifications, and there were a number of those that we did undertake. But again, the basic thrust of the strategy that he put in place, we felt was valid and needed to be continued. I did have to certainly put a great deal of emphasis into developing the concepts for and conduct of transition, and we worked through that in the first probably 4 or 5 months in considerable detail, and then presented that at the NATO summit in Lisbon where we also had the very significant action agreed to extend the horizon for Afghanistan, if you will, from 2011, the following year, to 2014. And of course, it's subsequently been pushed out beyond that. Beyond that, I felt quite strongly that there needed to be a program, again, somewhat similar to the Sons of Iraq program. I could do the math. I could recognize we were never going to achieve the numbers in the Afghan security forces necessary to push security out into a number of areas where it was lacking without a local program. And this ultimately became known as the Afghan Local Police Program. And our special forces organizations were the ones that drove that and then implemented it. We pursued initiatives in terms of countering corruption. We brought over Brigadier General then McMaster's, H.R. McMaster, very talented individual who had worked on numerous occasions for me in Iraq. And then subsequent to that also oversaw the assessment that was conducted when I assumed command of Central Command. And he established what was called Joint Task Force Shafafiyat, or transparency, which really was a nicer name for anti-corruption task force, which we pursued jointly with the Afghans appointed by President Karzai to do that. And it achieved, again, some significant results: the firing of the Air Force Chief of Staff, the Surgeon General, heads of some of the hospitals, and a variety of others, but not, again, the kind of wholesale impact across the board that we would have liked to have seen, and that was so important in achieving, because this was, corruption is a cancer that eats at the very institutions that we need to hand off tasks to in the process of transition. We made tweaks also to how we would actually implement the rules of engagement, how we employed close air support, indirect fires, and so forth, and loosened that up a bit. There was a sense among our troopers, legitimately, I think, that we were a bit too restrictive on that, and so we looked at the lessons of a year of that policy and then made refinements to how we did indeed allow units on the ground in tough circumstances to bring all the assets available to bear. Quite a wide amount of latitude, frankly. I did go to see the president after I was confirmed, and candidly, the president had gone all in on this, or at least that's what the way I characterized it to him. He actually said, "Well, we've doubled down here, General." And I said, "With respect, Mr. President, your military is going all in, and we need all the rest of the U.S. government and our coalition partners to go all in as well." Beyond that, there was not any specific guidance. It was basically to get over there and to do everything that we could to reverse a very seriously failing situation. There was nothing about clear, hold, and build, or I want you to conduct a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. In fact, frankly, really, we had a pretty broad amount of latitude. And as I've mentioned earlier, I changed the mission statement in the first few days. And frankly, I thought that was within my purview and latitude, and didn't bother to ask permission. We were told to get on with it, and that's what we sought to do. We ultimately overhauled the campaign plan after conducting a joint strategic assessment with a team of military and diplomatic and development work experts, and then began the process, obviously, of implementing these big ideas that I've described, of living with the people to secure them, pursuing reconciliation and promoting that very actively, increasing our operations against the irreconcilables, achieving civil-military unity of effort, overhauling our detainee affairs operations, and a variety of the other initiatives that we took in terms of stopping transition until the Iraqis could handle the tasks being given to them. Well, even as the commander in Iraq, I was concerned about developments in the region. that did have an influence on Iraq. And so I think that was understandable. And in fact, we suggested to our higher headquarters and indeed to the State Department and the White House actions that could be taken by those that were well beyond our purview, but would help dramatically to reduce the problems that we were facing. Actions by, for example, the State Department to convince countries in the region to not allow military-age males to fly on a one-way ticket to Damascus, Syria, and then make their way into Iraq and blow up Iraqis or coalition forces, or in some cases blow themselves up. We've tried to figure out what could be done to influence Iran to be less nefarious in its provision of assistance to Shia militia that were causing problems for the new Iraq. We worked on the neighboring countries, the Sunni Arab countries, to try to encourage them to engage Prime Minister Maliki, even though he is a Shia rather than a Sunni Arab. And so again, even though these were beyond the confines of Iraq, there were still issues that very much concerned us, and therefore issues on which we had some suggestions, recommendations, and encouragement to other elements that were supporting us well beyond the boundaries of the country for which we were responsible.